My name is Chelsea, 27 years old, and until recently, I was living under the oppressive shadow of my controlling parents. My entire life was scripted by them, from the clothes I wore to the career I should pursue. But when I got engaged to Derek, everything exploded. My parents delivered an ultimatum: break up with him or be disowned. When I chose love and freedom by cutting contact, they escalated to something I never imagined possible: death threats against us both. If you're watching this, let me know where you're tuning in from. Like and subscribe if you've ever had to break free from toxic family relationships, and stay with me to see how I reclaimed my life. Growing up in our affluent suburban Massachusetts home, I never realized how abnormal my childhood was. My father, William, a prominent surgeon at one of Boston's most prestigious hospitals, and my mother, Judith, a former beauty queen turned socialite, ran our household with military precision. As their only child, I wasn't treated as a person with my own desires and personality. Instead, I was their project, a carefully molded extension of themselves, imams, designed to fulfill the ambitions they deemed appropriate. Every aspect of my life fell under their scrutiny and control. My appearance was particularly important to my mother, who dressed me in expensive designer clothes that she selected. I remember begging for simple jeans and t-shirts like my classmates wore in 4th grade, only to be lectured for an hour about standards and reputation. My friendships were carefully monitored and curated. Any friend whose parents weren't in my parents' approved social circles quickly disappeared from my life. When I was 12, I became close with Amanda, whose father was a public school teacher. After Amanda visited once, my mother informed me we wouldn't be having her over again because her family wasn't suitable company. Every minute of my day was scheduled with appropriate activities. Piano lessons on Mondays and Wednesdays, tennis on Tuesdays and Thursdays, French tutoring on Fridays, and volunteer work my mother arranged at the hospital where my father worked on weekends. There was never time for normal childhood activities, or even just to relax and discover what I actually enjoyed. Independent thought was the gravest sin in our household. Whenever I expressed an opinion that differed from theirs, my parents employed sophisticated emotional manipulation. My father would withdraw completely, giving me the silent treatment for days. My mother would cry dramatically about how I'd hurt them both and claim I was destroying the family with my selfishness. During high school, I attempted small rebellions. I tried out for the school newspaper instead of debate team. I wore light makeup against their wishes. I asked to attend a public school where I could have more normal experiences. Each rebellion was swiftly and severely punished. My computer and phone were confiscated for weeks. I was grounded indefinitely. My father once threw away all the makeup he'd found in my room, while explaining that I was throwing away my future with my defiance. When college application time arrived, there was never any question about where I would go. My parents were both alumni of an Ivy League university, and I'd been groomed since birth to follow in their footsteps. They helped write my application essays, arranged alumni interviews through their connections, and celebrated when the acceptance letter arrived, as if their careful planning had finally paid off. My major was predetermined as well, pre-med. My father had decided I would become a surgeon like him, ideally at the same hospital. While I dutifully attended the required science classes, I secretly enrolled in marketing courses that fascinated me. These classes were the first time I felt genuine passion for a subject, and I excelled without the crushing pressure of my parents' expectations. College was also where I began to realize just how abnormal my family dynamic was. My roommate was shocked when I called my parents every night as required. Friends raised eyebrows when I had to send photos of myself at approved study locations. The few times friends met my parents during campus visits, they commented afterward about the tense atmosphere and controlling comments they witnessed. By senior year, I had made a secret decision that terrified me. I would not be applying to medical school. Instead, I had secured a position at a marketing firm in Boston, far enough from my parents' suburban home to create some distance, but not so far that they would completely object. The day after graduation, I finally revealed my plans. The resulting fight was explosive beyond anything I'd experienced before. My father turned purple with rage, shouting that I'd wasted their investment in my education. My mother collapsed in tears, wailing about betrayal. They threatened to cut me off financially, which they assumed would force me back in line. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing. I had saved money from campus jobs they didn't know about. My new position came with enough salary to support myself modestly. For the first time in my life at 22, I drove away from their house toward my own future in Boston. Those first years of independence were difficult but exhilarating. I lived in a tiny apartment with 2 roommates. I ate ramen noodles when money was tight. but I was making my own choices for the first time. My parents tried repeatedly to regain control through financial manipulation, offering to pay for a nicer apartment or a new car if I'd just reconsider my career choices. Each time I refused. Our relationship settled into a tense détente. I visited on major holidays. They criticized my choices while I deflected as best I could. I never fully broke free of their influence, but I had carved out a small space of independence. Little did I know that this fragile piece would shatter completely when I met the love of my life. 2 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I ducked into a coffee shop near my office to avoid a sudden downpour. The place was packed with other rain refugees, but there was one empty seat at a table where a man with kind eyes was working on his laptop. When I asked if I could join him, he smiled warmly and introduced himself as Derek. Derek was nothing like the type of men my parents had always pushed me toward. He wasn't from a prestigious family or pursuing a lucrative career in medicine or law. He was a middle-class guy from Minnesota who worked as an environmental engineer designing water conservation systems. His unpretentious manner and genuine interest in our conversation immediately put me at ease. We talked for 3 hours that first day, long after the rain had stopped. Derek asked questions about my work and actually listened to the answers. He shared stories about growing up in a small town outside Minneapolis with 3 siblings and parents who ran a local hardware store. There was something refreshing about his straightforward nature and the obvious pride he took in his humble background. When he asked for my number, I hesitated only briefly before giving it to him. For our first date that weekend, we went to a small art gallery opening and then walked along the harbour talking until midnight. I found myself sharing more about my interests and thoughts than I had with anyone before. At first, I kept our relationship completely hidden from my parents. During our weekly phone calls, I never mentioned Derek. When they visited Boston, I made excuses about work commitments to limit our time together. I was falling for Derek but terrified of my parents' reaction to him. Derek never pushed me to meet them. Instead, he encouraged me to pursue the things I was passionate about. When I mentioned an interest in photography, he surprised me with a second-hand camera and suggested weekend trips to capture New England landscapes. When I talked about possibly going back to school for an MBA someday, he helped me research programs and scholarships. After 4 months of dating, I finally told Derek about my childhood and the ongoing complicated relationship with my parents. We were at his apartment cooking dinner together when he asked an innocent question about family traditions. Something about his genuine interest broke down my walls, and I found myself pouring out the whole story. I told him about the rigid control, the emotional manipulation, the constant criticism. I explained how they still tried to direct my life from afar and how conflicted I felt between obligation and independence. As I spoke, I watched his expression change from curiosity to concern to outright shock. When I finished talking, Derek was quiet for a long moment. Then he took my hands and said something no one had ever said to me before that wasn't love, Chelsea. Parents who truly love their children want them to become their own people, not extensions of themselves. Those words unlocked something in me. For years, I'd believed that my parents' controlling behavior was just their way of showing love, that I was somehow ungrateful for chafing under their guidance. Derek helped me see that healthy love supports rather than controls. 6 months into our relationship, Derek invited me to visit his family in Minnesota during Thanksgiving. I was terrified about what to expect, but agreed to go. The contrast between his family and mine couldn't have been more striking. Derek's parents, Jack and Nancy, welcomed me with genuine warmth. Their home was modest but comfortable, filled with family photos and handmade quilts. His siblings teased him affectionately and immediately included me in family jokes. During meals, everyone talked over each other, disagreed openly without drama, and expressed their opinions freely. One evening, I accidentally broke a ceramic figurine while helping clean up after dinner. My instinctive reaction was panic. I froze, waiting for the explosion of anger or disappointment. Instead, Nancy helped me sweep up the pieces while telling me about how Derek had broken the matching 1 year ago playing indoor baseball. There was no blame, just a funny family story. As we flew back to Boston, I realized I'd experienced normal family dynamics for the first time. The freedom to be imperfect, to be yourself, to disagree respectfully, all things I'd never had growing up. Over the next year, Derek and I grew closer. Despite my fear of commitment stemming from my family experience, I found myself trusting him more each day. When we argued, he never used silence or emotional manipulation as weapons. When I struggled with anxiety before business presentations or family calls, he supported me without taking over. He was patient with my trust issues. There were times I withdrew emotionally, expecting rejection for minor mistakes. There were moments I tested his commitment unconsciously, recreating the conditional love dynamics I'd grown up with. Each time Derek responded with steady affection and clear communication. After a year together, we decided to move in together. My parents, who still didn't know about Derek, were horrified when I mentioned having a new roommate. They immediately offered to pay for my own apartment if I'd live alone. When I declined and finally mentioned I was living with my boyfriend, they went silent for a full minute before my mother changed the subject completely. It was their typical avoidance of anything that contradicted their vision for my life. Living with Derek accelerated my healing. Daily exposure to his healthy communication style and unconditional support helped me recognize and address my own unhealthy patterns. I became more confident at work, eventually securing a promotion to marketing manager. I made genuine friends instead of the strategic connections my parents had always encouraged. I started therapy to process my childhood experiences. As we approached our second anniversary, Derek and I began talking seriously about our future. I was 30 years old, and for the first time, I could imagine creating a family of my own, one where children were respected as individuals, and love wasn't used as leverage for control. Derek proposed during a weekend trip to coastal Maine. We'd hiked to a secluded lighthouse at sunset, and there on the rocky shore, he knelt and asked me to create a life with him. The ring was simple but beautiful, chosen with my taste in mind rather than to impress others. I said yes through happy tears, feeling a joy untainted by anxiety for perhaps the first time in my life. That joy was short-lived. As we celebrated over dinner that evening, Derek gently suggested it was time to tell my parents about our engagement in person. Despite everything he believed in, giving them a chance to be part of our happiness. His own family relationships had taught him that difficult dynamics could sometimes improve with important life transitions. I agreed with tremendous trepidation. Something told me this confrontation would be the final breaking point with my parents, but I also knew I couldn't truly move forward without facing them. We scheduled dinner at their home for the following weekend, and I spent the intervening days oscillating between hope and dread. The day of our dinner with my parents, I felt physically ill with anxiety. As Derek drove us to the affluent suburb where I grew up, I gave him last-minute warnings about my father's intimidation tactics and my mother's passive-aggressive comments. He squeezed my hand reassuringly and said, "Whatever happens, we're facing it together." My childhood home looked the same as always, perfectly manicured lawn, imposing colonial architecture, not a single thing out of place. As we walked up the stone path to the front door, I instinctively straightened my posture and checked my appearance habits ingrained from years of criticism. My mother answered the door with an artificial smile that didn't reach her eyes. She ear-kissed my cheeks and gave Derek a limp handshake, her gaze quickly assessing his off-the-rack suit and department store watch. My father waited in the foyer, tall and imposing in his custom suit, offering a perfunctory greeting while subtly establishing dominance with his firm handshake and direct stare. Dinner was excruciating. We sat in the formal dining room with the good china and crystal, a setting designed to intimidate. The conversation consisted of my parents interrogating Derek about his background. Each answer met with thin smiles and exchanged glances. When Derek mentioned growing up in Minnesota, my father commented that he'd only been there once for a medical conference and couldn't understand why anyone would choose to live somewhere so provincial. When Derek explained his work developing sustainable water systems for communities, my mother asked if there was really any money in that sort of thing, as if his career value could only be measured in dollars. Throughout the meal, they made subtle jabs about his background. My father asked which prep school he had attended, his disappointed nod when Derek named his public high school speaking volumes. My mother inquired about his parents, her eyebrows rising when he mentioned the hardware store, asking if it was at least a chain. Despite their rudeness, Derek remained polite and engaged. He answered their questions honestly, without apology for his middle-class background. He tried repeatedly to find common ground, asking my father about his interest in sailing and complimenting my mother's artwork displayed in the dining room. After dessert was served, I gathered my courage and reached for Derek's hand under the table. I took a deep breath and announced that we had news to share. We were engaged. I extended my left hand to show my mother's engagement ring, a simple solitaire, that I'd chosen with Derek because it represented our authentic relationship, not the ostentatious display my parents would have preferred. The silence that followed was deafening. My father froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. My mother stared at the ring as if I'd presented her with a dead insect. Several seconds passed before my father set down his cup with deliberate precision. Chelsea, he said in the calm, condescending tone he used with difficult patience, I think you're confused about what you're doing. This is clearly just a phase you're going through, some kind of delayed rebellion. After his dismissal of my engagement, he turned to Derek. Young man, I appreciate your interest in my daughter, but you must understand that Chelsea has certain obligations to her family name and position. My mother jumped in, her voice dripping with false concern. Darling, she said, reaching across to pat my hand while pointedly avoiding looking at my ring. You can't possibly be serious about this. The ring is sweet, but let's be realistic about your future. She turned to Derek with a tight smile. No offense intended. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the feeling of my autonomy being stripped away, my decisions invalidated. But this time something was different. I had Derek beside me and 2 years of growing independence behind me. I straightened my shoulders and said firmly, we're very serious. We love each other and we've made this decision together. My father scoffed, Chelsea, love is what people without prospects talk about. Marriage in our circle is about suitable matches and shared backgrounds. He leaned forward, his voice hardening. In fact, we've already been in discussions with the Harringtons. Their son James has finished his surgical residency and is looking to settle down. He's perfect for you. I was stunned. James Harrington was the arrogant son of my father's colleague, a man I'd met at hospital functions who had always made me uncomfortable with his entitled attitude and wandering hands. The idea that my parents had been arranging a match for me behind my back, as if I were living in some Victorian novel, was both infuriating and sadly unsurprising. That's not happening, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I'm marrying Derek. I don't need or want your permission, but I had hoped for your blessing. My mother began to cry practiced tears that she'd used to manipulate me throughout childhood. Chelsea, how can you be so selfish? We've given you everything. We've planned your whole life to give you the best advantages. And now you want to throw it all away for some nobody. From Minnesota, her voice broke on the last word, as if being from the Midwest was a terminal diagnosis. The argument escalated quickly. My father abandoned his normally controlled facade and began shouting about ingratitude and poor judgment. My mother alternated between dramatic sobs and cutting remarks about Derek's obvious unsuitability. I found myself yelling back, releasing decades of pent-up resentment about their controlling behavior. Derek tried to diffuse the situation, speaking calmly about how he understood their concern as parents, but hoped they could get to know him better over time. His reasonable tone seemed to infuriate my father even more. Listen to me, my father said, jabbing a finger toward my face. You have a choice to make right now, Chelsea. You can end this ridiculous engagement and come back to your senses, or you can consider yourself disowned. No support, no inheritance, no family. He stood up, towering over the table. I won't have my daughter throwing her life away on someone so clearly beneath her station. Derek stood then too, his voice firm but not aggressive. Sir, with all due respect, Chelsea is an adult capable of making her own choices. I love your daughter and I will support her in whatever relationship she wants to have with you, but I won't stand by while you threaten and demean her. My father turned purple with rage. He stepped around the table toward Derek, fists clenched. You have no right to speak in my house. You have no right to my daughter. If you think I'm going to let some middle-class nobody from nowhere take what I've spent a lifetime building, you're sadly mistaken. For a terrifying moment, I thought my father might physically attack Derek. I moved between them and said, we are leaving. Now, this conversation is over. As we gathered our coats, my mother made one final manipulative plea. Chelsea, if you walk out that door with him, don't expect to be welcomed back. Parents know best, darling. You're making a terrible mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your life. My father, still shaking with rage, pointed at Derek. And you think you can come into our lives and steal our daughter? This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Derek put his arm around me protectively as we walked toward the door. That's when my father called after us. If you go through with this, it'll make sure neither of you has a future. I'll take care of it personally. The house security guard summoned by my father escorted us off the property, treating us like trespassers rather than family. As we drove away, I finally broke down sobbing uncontrollably at the bridge burned and the open threat my father had made. Derek held me close when we got back to our apartment, reassuring me we'd get through this together. That night, through my tears, I made the decision to cut contact completely. The confrontation had made one thing crystal clear: my parents would never see me as an autonomous adult deserving of respect. Their love had always been conditional on my compliance, and that wasn't love at all. The morning after the confrontation, I changed my phone number and blocked my parents on every social media platform. I sent a brief email explaining that I needed space and would not be in contact for the foreseeable future. Derek helped me create new email addresses and update my privacy settings everywhere. Those first days of no contact brought an unexpected sense of relief. The constant background anxiety of waiting for their disapproval disappeared. I didn't have to rehearse conversations or defend my choices. I could simply live my life without the weight of their judgment. But mixed with that relief was a profound grief. Despite everything, they were still my parents. I'd spent 27 years trying to earn their approval and acceptance. Acknowledging that it might never come felt like mourning a death, the death of the loving parent-child relationship I had always craved but never had. My friends in Boston rallied around us. Many had witnessed my parents' controlling behavior over the years and supported my decision to create boundaries. Derek was my rock, never once suggesting I reconcile for his sake, always emphasizing that my mental health and autonomy were the priority. About a week into our no-contact period, a large package arrived at our apartment. Inside was an elaborate designer wedding dress, clearly expensive, and exactly the over-the-top style my mother would choose. Pinned to it was a handwritten note. "You know what you need to do to make things right. Well, be waiting. We expect your call by Sunday." The presumption that I would abandon my engagement for a dress however expensive would have been laughable if it weren't so disturbing. The note had no well wishes, no congratulations, just an expectation of compliance. I donated the dress to a charity that provided wedding attire to women who couldn't afford it. As the weeks passed, my parents' escalation began. They contacted friends from college asking them to talk sense into me. They reached out to colleagues at my marketing firm expressing concerns about my mental health. The company receptionist reported that my mother had called multiple times, becoming increasingly demanding about speaking to me. Then they showed up at my workplace. I was in a client meeting when my assistant urgently pulled me out to say my parents were in the lobby, causing a scene and refusing to leave until they spoke with me. The company's security escorted them out, but the damage to my professional reputation was concerning. I had to explain the situation to my boss, who was thankfully understanding, but advised me to resolve my personal issues outside of work. The invasion of my workplace was followed by an even more alarming incident. Arriving home one evening, Derek spotted my father sitting in a car across from our apartment building. He appeared to have been waiting for one of us to arrive alone. When Derek approached the car, my father sped away without speaking. This stalking behavior terrified me. We decided to move apartments immediately, finding a secure building with doorman security where we could provide my parents' photos with instructions not to admit them. The expense stretched our budget, but the peace of mind was worth every penny. Around this time, I joined a support group for adult children of narcissistic parents. Hearing others' stories helped me understand I wasn't alone or crazy for establishing boundaries. One woman in the group recommended a therapist who specialized in family trauma, and I began weekly sessions that helped me process my guilt and fear. Derek's family was amazingly supportive throughout this ordeal. His parents offered us refuge in Minnesota if things got worse, and his sister called regularly to check on us. Their normal, healthy family concern was a stark contrast to my parents' obsessive control. Derek was worried about dragging his family into our troubles, but I was deeply touched by their unfailing support. Despite my therapist's reassurance that I was making healthy choices, I struggled with the cultural programming that children should always forgive parents no matter what. Each time I considered reaching out to smooth things over, Derek gently reminded me of my father's threatening words and their escalating behavior. This wasn't a simple disagreement. This was a pattern of control turning dangerous. 2 months into our no-contact period, the situation took another disturbing turn. A colleague spotted someone photographing me entering and leaving our new apartment building. Derek hired a private investigator who confirmed our fears my parents had employed someone to follow us and report on our activities. We filed a police report, but the officer's response was frustrating. Because my parents had made no specific violent threats and had significant community standing, the police viewed it as a family dispute rather than stalking. One officer even suggested I just talk to my parents and work things out, completely missing the dynamics at play. Despite these challenges, Derek and I decided to move forward with our wedding plans. We abandoned the idea of a large ceremony and instead planned a small gathering with close friends and Derek's family at a scenic outdoor location. We told no one the specific venue until days before and hired security as a precaution. 1 week before our planned ceremony, a courier delivered an unmarked package to my office. My assistant brought it to my desk, commenting that the delivery person had been insistent it reach me personally. Something about this made me uneasy, but I opened it anyway. Inside was a mock-up wedding photo of Derek and me, clearly digitally created, using pictures from my private social media, with our faces crossed out in red marker. Accompanying it was a typed note. "This marriage will never happen. If you continue with this, neither of you will have a future. Last chance to make the right choice." Finding the death threat in that package triggered an immediate panic attack. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I felt like the room was spinning. My assistant saw my distress and called Derek, who left work immediately to come to me. When he arrived and saw the threatening materials, his face hardened with determination. "This has gone too far, Chelsea. We're going to the police right now, and this time we're not leaving until they're taking this seriously." At the police station, we were assigned to an officer who seemed bored by our situation. He flipped through the photos and note without much interest and said, "Look, this is clearly a family situation getting out of hand. Parents don't usually follow through with this kind of thing. They're just trying to scare you." Derek insisted, "But isn't making death threats a crime regardless of who makes them?" The officer sighed and reluctantly took our statement, but his dismissive attitude made it clear that nothing would come of it. As we suspected, my parents' connections in the community were shielding them from consequences. Over the next few days, the impact of my parents' campaign against us spread. My boss called me into her office to discuss concerning calls she'd received about my stability. Apparently, someone matching my father's description had spoken to several clients, suggesting I was having a mental health crisis that might affect my work. She was supportive, but concerned about client relationships. The situation worsened when Derek found his car vandalized in our secure parking garage. The tires were slashed and carved into the paint were the words, "Stay away from her." When we reviewed security footage with building management, it showed a person whose face was carefully hidden from cameras, but the expensive watch visible on their wrist was identical to one my father wore. Our wedding plans were next to fall. 3 days before the ceremony, the venue called to inform us they had to cancel due to an emergency. When pressed, the manager reluctantly admitted they'd received calls questioning the legality of our event and threatening legal action against the property. Rather than risk involvement in what was described to them as a complicated legal situation, they refunded our deposit and wished us well. That evening, sitting among the ruins of our plans, I hit my lowest point. Maybe we should just postpone the wedding, I suggested to Derek, tears streaming down my face. Maybe if I talk to them, pretend to reconsider, they might back off long enough for us to figure out a better plan. Derek knelt before me, taking my hands in his. "Chelsea, listen to me. That is exactly what they want to make you so miserable, so frightened that you give in. If we do that, it will never end. They'll control every decision for the rest of our lives." I knew he was right, but the fear was overwhelming. They seem willing to do anything to stop us. What if they actually try to hurt you? I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because of my family. Derek was quiet for a moment before responding. "When I proposed to you, I promised to stand by you no matter what. That includes this. We're going to fight this together the right way." His determination gave me strength when mine was faltering. The next morning, we consulted with a specialized attorney who had experience with stalking and harassment cases. Unlike the police, she took our situation extremely seriously. She explained that what my parents were doing constituted criminal harassment and possibly terroristic threatening. We spent hours documenting every incident, the confrontation at dinner, the unwanted gifts with manipulative notes, the workplace appearances, the stalking, the private investigator, the vandalism and the death threats. The attorney helped us organize it all chronologically with supporting evidence, photos, emails, witness statements, and security footage. With her guidance, we filed for a temporary restraining order immediately and began the process for a permanent order. She warned us that my parents would likely fight it and use their connections to discredit us, but she believed the evidence was compelling enough to overcome their influence. As we prepared for the court hearing, I felt a strange sense of empowerment growing alongside my fear. For the first time, I was taking concrete action against their manipulation rather than trying to avoid or appease it. This wasn't just about our wedding anymore, it was about claiming my right to an autonomous life. We spent days gathering additional evidence and securing witnesses. Several of my colleagues agreed to testify about the workplace disruptions. Our building manager provided security footage and incident reports. Even my therapist prepared a professional statement about the emotional impact of the harassment. Derek was absolutely steadfast throughout the process. He spent hours with our attorney preparing his own testimony, never once suggesting we take an easier path. When I apologized for dragging him into this nightmare, he stopped me mid-sentence. "Chelsea, your parents need to understand that you're not alone anymore. You have someone who will stand with you no matter what they throw at us." While we were in the final stages of preparation, a truly terrifying development occurred. Derek's sister called in a panic to tell us that someone had approached his 7-year-old niece at her elementary school in Minnesota asking questions about her uncle Derek and when he might be visiting next. The school security had intervened, but the person had claimed to be a family friend and left before police arrived. The idea that my parents would involve an innocent child in their campaign of control was the breaking point for me. Any lingering doubt or guilt about taking legal action evaporated instantly. This was no longer about me or even Derek. This was about protecting everyone we loved from people who had no moral boundaries. The night before our court date, I barely slept. I alternated between anxiety about facing my parents and absolute clarity that this confrontation was necessary. As dawn broke, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whatever happened in court, I was finally taking a stand. The courthouse was imposing all marble columns and echoing hallways. Our attorney met us at the entrance, her confidence reassuring as she guided us to the correct courtroom. We arrived early to prepare, but my stomach dropped when I saw my parents enter with their own legal team, 3 attorneys in expensive suits, carrying leather briefcases and exuding confidence. My father was dressed impeccably in his best suit, the picture of respectability. My mother had chosen a conservative outfit that made her look like a concerned parent, rather than someone who had participated in months of harassment. They didn't acknowledge us directly, but I could feel my mother's eyes examining me for signs of weakness. When our case was called, I took a deep breath and walked forward with Derek and our attorney. The judge was an older woman with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency. She reviewed the case file briefly before looking up at both parties over her reading glasses. Before testimony began, my parents' attorney attempted to frame the situation as a simple family disagreement blown out of proportion by an overly dramatic daughter and her inappropriate boyfriend. The judge cut him off mid-sentence. "Counselor, the file before me contains allegations of stalking, harassment, and death threats. Let's proceed with testimony and evidence before characterizing the nature of this dispute. I was called to testify first." With a surprisingly steady voice, I detailed the lifelong pattern of control that had culminated in the recent escalation. I described the dinner confrontation, the explicit threats, and the subsequent campaign of harassment. I presented the threatening notes, the doctored wedding photo, and timeline of incidents. The most difficult part was maintaining my composure, while describing how their behavior had affected me psychologically. The constant fear, the workplace embarrassment, the strain on my relationship, the nightmares that had begun after finding the death threat. Through it all, I could feel my parents staring at me, my mother's dramatic sighs and my father's clenched jaw visible in my peripheral vision. When cross-examination began, my parents' attorney tried to portray me as unstable and ungrateful. He implied I had a history of dramatic overreactions and asked if I'd been treated for mental illness. Our attorney objected successfully to the most inappropriate questions, but the strategy was clear. They hoped to discredit me as emotionally unreliable. Derek testified next, calmly describing the events from his perspective. He was particularly effective when explaining the incident with his niece, his voice breaking slightly as he described his sister's panic call. The judge paid close attention to his account of the car vandalism and the threatening package. During Derek's testimony, I noticed something unexpected. Several court employees and even the judge's clerk were exchanging glances when he described my parents' behavior. It slowly dawned on me that my parents might be well known in these circles and perhaps not positively. Our attorney called several supporting witnesses. My boss testified about the disruptive calls to clients. The building manager confirmed the security footage of the car vandalism. A former colleague described witnessing my mother's inappropriate behavior at my office. The most surprising testimony came from someone I hadn't expected. My father's sister, Aunt Margaret, whom I'd barely seen in years, had contacted our attorney after somehow learning about the restraining order proceedings. She testified about witnessing similar controlling behavior from my father toward me throughout my childhood, corroborating my account of the family dynamics. When it was my parents' turn to present their side, their attorneys called my father to the stand first. He presented himself as a concerned parent trying to protect his daughter from a hasty decision. He spoke about the excellent upbringing and opportunities he'd provided me, portraying himself as bewildered by my sudden rejection of family values. He denied making threats, suggested the vandalism was coincidental, and claimed any gifts or contacts were merely attempts to reconcile with a beloved daughter. He portrayed Derek as an opportunist who had isolated me from my loving family. During cross-examination, our attorney was methodical. She established the timeline of events and repeatedly contrasted my father's denials with the documented evidence. The turning point came when she asked directly about the private investigator. "Did you hire someone to follow your daughter and her fiancé?" she asked. My father hesitated too long before saying, "I was concerned for her well-being." "So you admit to having them followed?" the attorney pressed. In a moment of arrogance, my father made a critical mistake. "I have resources and connections, and I used them to keep an eye on my daughter during what I believed was a personal crisis. Any loving parent would do the same." The judge interrupted at this point. "Sir, for clarity, you are admitting under oath that you hired someone to follow your adult daughter without her knowledge or consent." My father seemed to suddenly realize the hole he had dug for himself. "I was acting out of parental concern," he said stiffly. My mother testified next, playing the role of heartbroken mother perfectly. She dabbed at tears while describing her confusion over my rejection of their love. She denied knowledge of any threatening behavior and suggested I had always been prone to exaggeration. Her performance might have been convincing if not for the substantial evidence contradicting it. During cross-examination, she became flustered when presented with copies of the notes she had written. When asked directly about the wedding dress delivery and its accompanying ultimatum, she claimed it was merely a gift with a request for communication, not a threat. After all testimony concluded, the judge took only a brief recess before returning with her decision. "The evidence clearly supports the petition for a restraining order," she stated firmly. "The pattern of behavior described and documented constitutes harassment and suggests an escalating situation that could indeed pose a danger to the petitioners." She issued a comprehensive restraining order prohibiting my parents from contacting me or Derek directly or through third parties, requiring them to stay at least 500 feet away from our home and workplaces, and specifically barring any contact with Derek's family members. The order would remain in effect for 3 years, with violations potentially resulting in criminal charges. As the judge announced her decision, I watched my parents' faces. My father's expression hardened into cold fury, while my mother looked genuinely shocked, as if she couldn't believe her performance hadn't won the day. For the first time in my life, their manipulation had failed publicly and officially. Court officers escorted us out separately from my parents to ensure no confrontation. As we left the courthouse with our attorney, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and grief. The legal system had recognized and validated the reality of my parents' behavior, but I had also just severed the last tenuous connection to my family of origin. In the weeks that followed, we learnt that my parents had violated the restraining order almost immediately. They'd sent a mutual family friend to our apartment with a message about reconciliation if I would just reconsider my choices. Our attorney filed a violation report, and the police finally took action, issuing my father a formal warning. More serious consequences followed for my father professionally. The hospital where he practiced launched an ethics investigation after learning about the restraining order. Apparently, there had been previous concerns about his controlling behavior toward nursing staff, and this public legal issue provided the impetus for a formal review. His hospital privileges were suspended pending the outcome. My mother's social standing suffered as well. The court proceedings were public record, and word spread quickly through their social circles. Several charity boards she sat on quietly asked her to step down, citing concerns about negative publicity. Despite these consequences for my parents, Derek and I focused on moving forward. We rescheduled our wedding as a small ceremony on a friend's private property with security discreetly present. On a beautiful Saturday in June, surrounded by true friends and Derek's loving family, we exchanged vows and began our married life together. Our brief honeymoon was a weekend at a coastal inn in Maine, returning to the place where Derek had proposed. We walked the same beach now as husband and wife, and I felt a peace I'd never known before. The constant vigilance I'd lived with my entire life began to ease, replaced by the security of genuine love and support. When we returned home, a certified letter from my parents' attorney was waiting. I opened it with trembling hands, fearing more threats. Instead, it was formal notification that I had been removed from their will and would receive no inheritance or future support. They were officially disowning me, just as they'd threatened. What surprised me most was my reaction. Instead of pain, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The last hold they had over me was gone. I was truly free. When I received the letter officially disowning me, I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt as though the final chain binding me to my toxic past had been broken. For the first time in my life, there was nothing my parents could hold over me, no inheritance to threaten, withholding no family name to tarnish. I was simply Chelsea, free to build the life I chose with the man I loved. The months that followed were dedicated to healing. My therapist helped me understand the complex nature of narcissistic abuse and how it had shaped my perceptions and behaviors. I learned that the constant anxiety I'd lived with wasn't normal, that the voice in my head criticizing my every decision wasn't my own but an internalized version of my parents' judgment. Our support group became a lifeline. Sitting in a circle with others who'd experienced similar family dynamics, I no longer felt like the odd one out. These people understood the bizarre contradiction of loving someone who had hurt you deeply. They recognized the guilt and doubt that plagued even the most confident decisions to establish boundaries. Derek was incredibly patient throughout this process. He held me through nightmares where I was being chased by shadowy figures. He reassured me when I doubted my worth or questioned whether I'd made the right choice. He never once complained about the complications my family had brought into our lives. 3 months after our wedding, an exciting opportunity arose at my company. They were opening a new branch office in Chicago and wanted me to lead the marketing team there. The position came with a significant promotion and the chance to build something from the ground up. Derek and I discussed it extensively. His environmental engineering skills were in demand nationwide, and he could easily find meaningful work in Chicago. The move would take us even farther from my parents' sphere of influence in New England, giving us a truly fresh start. Most importantly, it felt like a chance to define ourselves on our own terms, away from the shadow of my family history. We made the move that fall, finding a cozy apartment in a vibrant Chicago neighborhood. Derek soon secured a position with a firm, working on Lake Michigan water quality projects. We made new friends, explored our new city, and began creating traditions that were uniquely ours. Weekend brunches at a local cafe, volunteering at an urban garden, Sunday afternoon walks along the lakeshore. Although the restraining order remained in effect, I occasionally heard news of my parents, through mutual acquaintances, who remained in contact with both sides. The hospital ethics investigation had resulted in my father being placed on extended probation and required to complete courses on professional behavior. His practice had reportedly suffered as patients requested other surgeons. My mother had withdrawn from many of her social activities after several uncomfortable encounters with former friends. According to one source, she'd been publicly confronted at a charity gala about their treatment of me by a woman whose daughter had also cut contact with controlling parents. The social humiliation had apparently been significant. I felt surprisingly little satisfaction at hearing about these consequences. I didn't want revenge or punishment, I simply wanted peace and distance. Their downfall brought me no joy, only a sad recognition that they were experiencing the natural results of their own behavior. As our first anniversary approached, I received an unexpected letter. Unlike the formal legal document that had disowned me, this was a personal letter, handwritten on simple stationery. It was from my father's sister, Aunt Margaret, who had testified on my behalf during the restraining order hearing. "My dear Chelsea," she wrote, "I've been thinking about you often and wanted to reach out now that some time has passed. What you may not know is that the controlling behavior you experienced is part of a longer family pattern. Your grandmother, my mother, stood up to similar treatment from her own parents when she married your grandfather against their wishes. They disowned her too, and she never reconciled with them. History repeats itself in our family, it seems, but you have shown the same courage she did in breaking the cycle." The letter went on to explain that several extended family members had been pushed away over the years for failing to comply with my father's rigid expectations. Aunt Margaret had maintained minimal contact for family information, but had always disagreed with how I was raised. She hadn't felt able to intervene when I was younger, but had been proud to support me in court. She enclosed old family photos I'd never seen and contact information for cousins I'd been told were distant or disinterested in family connections. I reached out cautiously and over the following months discovered a network of extended family who welcomed me warmly. These relationships helped fill the void left by my parents' absence, providing a sense of belonging and history that I'd feared was lost forever. As I rebuilt my sense of family, I also felt compelled to help others. I started a blog anonymously at first about narcissistic family dynamics and establishing healthy boundaries. I shared my experiences, the warning signs I'd missed, and the steps I'd taken to reclaim my life. To my surprise, the blog quickly gained followers, many sharing similar stories, and thanking me for putting words to experiences they'd struggled to understand. As the blog grew, I began receiving messages from people in active crisis with controlling family members. With Derek's encouragement, I took courses in peer counseling and eventually partnered with a family therapist to create more structured resources. What had begun as personal healing evolved into a mission to help others recognize and escape similar situations. 2 years after cutting contact with my parents, Derek and I received our most joyous news: we were expecting our first child. The pregnancy brought a complex mix of emotions. Alongside our excitement came my deep fear of repeating patterns my parents had established. Would I know how to parent lovingly without controlling? Would I recognize if I started using the same manipulative tactics that had been used on me? Derek and I enrolled in parenting classes together, not just to learn about infant care, but to discuss and establish our parenting philosophy. We made explicit commitments to respect our child's autonomy, to discipline with consistency and kindness rather than manipulation, and to always prioritize emotional safety. We wrote these commitments down, planning to review them regularly as reminders of the parents we aspired to be. As my due date approached, I reflected deeply on the journey that had brought me here. 5 years earlier, I had been a marketing assistant, living in a tiny apartment, still calling my parents daily for approval of my most minor decisions. Now I was a marketing director with a successful side project, helping others, married to a man who supported my growth rather than limiting it, and preparing to become a mother who would break generational patterns of control. The transformation hadn't been easy. It had required facing my deepest fears, standing firm against manipulation and threats, and rebuilding my understanding of what family truly means. But sitting in the nursery Derek and I had created, surrounded by evidence of our love and commitment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. I realized that the most important boundary I had established wasn't the legal restraining order, although that had been necessary. The most crucial boundary was the internal one I had built, the clear understanding that love doesn't control or diminish. Real love supports growth, respects differences, and celebrates independence within connection. Breaking free from my parents' control had been the most difficult and most rewarding decision of my life. The price had been high, losing my family of origin and weathering their campaign of harassment and threats. But the reward was beyond measure: the freedom to build a life of authenticity and joy, and the opportunity to create a family based on respect rather than fear. As I placed my hand on my growing belly, I made a silent promise to my child. You will always know that you are loved for exactly who you are, not for who we want you to be. You will learn that boundaries are healthy, that your voice matters, and that your parents are imperfect humans who can admit mistakes. Most importantly, you will never doubt that your worth is inherent, not something to be earned through compliance. This is the lesson that standing up to narcissistic control taught me. Creating boundaries is not selfish, it's an act of self-love that allows for healthier relationships with everyone in your life. Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations, and finding the courage to say no to toxic love opens the door to experiencing genuine love in all its messy, wonderful reality. Have you ever had to establish difficult boundaries with family members? How did you find the strength to stand your ground? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story helped you recognize unhealthy patterns in your own relationships, please like and subscribe for more content about healing from family trauma. Remember, sometimes the family we choose brings more healing than the family we're born into. Thank you for listening to my story.